On the morning of November 23, 1942, in a cramped communications bunker, 30 kilometers west of the Volga River, senior telephone operator Anna Mikhailovna Volkova sat before her switchboard, headset pressed against her ears, monitoring the labyrinth of military lines that connected the Soviet command structure. The temperature inside hovered just above freezing, her breath forming small clouds as she methodically checked each connection, ensuring the lifelines of communication remained intact. Outside, the landscape stretched in an endless expanse of snow-covered steppe, punctuated by the distant rumble of artillery that had become as constant as her own heartbeat. She believed this would be another routine shift, another 12 hours of connecting calls, relaying orders, maintaining the invisible threads that held an army together. She had no idea that within the next hour, she would intercept a conversation that would illuminate the catastrophic mistake already unfolding around the city of Stalingrad, a mistake that would seal the fate of hundreds of thousands of men. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Anna would hear that day would transform her from a faithful communications operator, following protocol, into a woman who made an impossible choice, one that would haunt her for the rest of her life, while simultaneously revealing the full scope of a strategic disaster that was, even as she listened, becoming irreversible. Anna Mikhailovna Volkova was 26 years old that November, born in Leningrad to a family of telecommunications workers. Her father had helped install telephone lines across the city in the 1920s, and she had grown up understanding the poetry of connected voices, the way distance could collapse through copper wire and human speech. When the conflict began in 1941, she volunteered immediately, her technical expertise making her invaluable to the Military Communications Corps. By the autumn of 1942, she had been assigned to a critical hub that connected field commanders with higher headquarters, a position that required absolute discretion, flawless technical knowledge, and the ability to work 18-hour shifts when necessary. The bunker where she worked had been dug into a hillside, reinforced with timber and earth, its entrance concealed beneath camouflage netting that made it nearly invisible from the air. Inside, 4 switchboards managed over 200 lines, connecting artillery batteries, tank divisions, infantry regiments, supply depots, and medical stations across a front that stretched for hundreds of kilometers. Anna and 3 other operators worked in rotating shifts, their fingers dancing across the patch cords and switches with practiced precision. Their voices calm and professional, even when the messages they relayed spoke of desperate situations and mounting casualties. The rules governing their work were absolute. They were never to listen to conversations after making connections. They were to disconnect immediately once the parties began speaking. They were to report any suspicious activity or unauthorized use of the lines. They were to maintain complete confidentiality about everything they heard, even among themselves. These regulations had been drilled into them during training, reinforced with stories of operators who had violated protocol and faced severe consequences. The military communications system functioned on trust and discipline, and telephone operators were expected to be nothing more than invisible facilitators, ghosts in the machine who connected voices without absorbing their content. Anna had always followed these rules perfectly. In 18 months of service, she had never once deliberately listened to a conversation after making a connection. She took pride in her professionalism, in the way she could manage multiple simultaneous calls without error, in her reputation as someone commanders could rely upon absolutely. On the morning of November 23rd, she arrived for her shift at 600 hours, relieving the night operator with the standard exchange of information about line status and pending connections. Everything seemed normal. The front had been relatively stable for several days. The massive encirclement operation that Soviet forces had launched 4 days earlier on November 19th was proceeding according to plan, and the mood among the communications staff was cautiously optimistic. At 7:23 that morning, a call came through on a line designated for high-priority command traffic. The connection request came from a forward headquarters unit that Anna recognized as belonging to a senior officer in the armored forces. The requested destination was a strategic planning office located far to the east beyond the immediate combat zone. this was not unusual. Senior officers frequently needed to communicate with rear headquarters about logistics, reinforcements, and strategic coordination. Anna followed standard procedure, checking the line for clarity, ensuring the connection was secure, and then patching the call through. What happened next violated every instinct of her training. As she reached to disconnect her monitoring position, she heard something in the voice of the officer speaking that made her pause. It was not his words, not yet. It was the tone, a quality of barely controlled panic mixed with disbelief that was so unusual for a senior military officer that her hand froze halfway to the disconnect switch. She knew she should pull the connection immediately. She knew that listening constituted a serious breach of protocol. But something in that voice told her this was not a routine call, and after 18 months of hearing thousands of military conversations, she had developed an instinct for recognizing when something was desperately wrong. So Anna Mikhailovna Volkova made a choice. She left her monitoring connection active, and she listened. The officer identified himself with a code designation she recognized as belonging to Colonel Dmitry Pavlovich Gordov, a tank commander whose unit had been involved in the encirclement operations. His voice was hoarse, exhausted, and shaking with an emotion that took Anna a moment to identify because it was so unexpected. Fear. Not the fear of immediate combat, which she had heard many times in the voices of men under attack, but a deeper, more existential fear, the fear of someone who has seen something that should not exist. Gordov was speaking to someone at strategic headquarters, someone senior enough that the colonel's voice held both desperation and deference. And what he was saying filled Anna with deep alarm. The German forces trapped in Stalingrad, Gordov reported, numbered far more than anyone had estimated. The encirclement had closed on November 22nd, just the previous day, trapping what Soviet intelligence had believed to be perhaps 90,000 enemy troops. But Gordov had been compiling reports from multiple units involved in the encirclement, cross-referencing prisoner interrogations, aerial reconnaissance, and captured documents. His numbers painted a radically different picture. There were not 90,000 men trapped in the pocket around Stalingrad. There were closer to 300,000. An entire army, complete with support units, logistics personnel, headquarters staff, and attached divisions that intelligence had believed were located elsewhere. The officer on the other end of the line, whose voice was calmer but carried the weight of high authority, asked Gordov to confirm his estimates. Could he be certain? Was this not perhaps an overcount, a multiplication of the same units reported by different sources? Anna heard Gordov's response, and in it she heard the voice of a man who had triple-checked his calculations precisely because he could not believe them himself. He was certain. He had documented evidence from 12 different sources. He had personally interrogated captured officers who confirmed they were part of units that Soviet intelligence had placed 200 kilometers away. The German military presence in Stalingrad was 3 times larger than anyone had planned for. Then came the part that made Anna understand why Gordov sounded terrified. He asked the question that she realized had been the real purpose of his call. Given these numbers, given the massive force now trapped in the pocket, should the command structure reconsider the supply calculations? Because the current plans for containing the encirclement, the resources allocated to preventing breakout attempts, the artillery support, the defensive positions, all of these had been calculated based on containing 90,000 men, not 300,000. 300,000 men would require 3 times the guard force, 3 times the ammunition expenditure, 3 times the vigilance, and more critically, 300,000 men would consume supplies at a rate that made their situation theoretically sustainable if they received aerial resupply. The senior officer's response was what transformed Anna's unauthorized listening from a breach of protocol into something that felt like a moral obligation. The voice from strategic headquarters told Gordov that his numbers had been noted and would be forwarded to the appropriate planning divisions. But the current operation would proceed as designed. The encirclement would hold. The trapped forces would be contained. Supply calculations would be adjusted as necessary. Gordov should return his focus to his immediate tactical responsibilities and trust that strategic decisions were being made with all available information. It was a bureaucratic dismissal, polite but firm, and Anna heard in it something that chilled her more than the winter cold seeping through the bunker walls. The senior officer was not surprised by Gordov's numbers. He had listened without shock, without the questions that would have come from someone hearing this information for the first time, which meant that somewhere in the command structure, someone already knew that 300,000 enemy soldiers were trapped in Stalingrad, and they had decided not to change the plan. The call ended. Anna sat in silence, her hand still on the connection she should have severed 5 minutes earlier, her mind racing through the implications of what she had heard. 300,000 men. The number was staggering. It represented not just a military force, but a small city's worth of human beings, all trapped in an increasingly desperate situation as winter closed around them. And if the Soviet command structure was not adjusting its containment strategy to account for these numbers, it meant they were either catastrophically underestimating the situation, or they had decided that the current plan was adequate despite the massive discrepancy. Anna tried to imagine 300,000 men trapped in the ruins of a city, surrounded by hostile forces, with winter deepening and supply lines cut. She thought about the mathematics of it, the daily requirements for food, ammunition, medical supplies, fuel. She thought about what it would take to keep that many men alive through a Russian winter, and what would happen if those supplies failed to arrive in sufficient quantities. And then she understood the full horror of what Gordov had been asking about, the question beneath the question. If the German command believed they had 90,000 men to supply and actually had 300,000, their aerial resupply effort would be catastrophically insufficient. The trapped soldiers would begin starving not over months, but over weeks. She also understood something else, something that made her own position suddenly precarious. She had heard something she was never meant to hear. She had knowledge of a strategic intelligence failure or decision that was clearly classified at the highest levels. And she had acquired this knowledge through a direct violation of communications protocol. If she reported what she had heard, she would have to explain how she came to hear it. If she did not report it, she would be keeping critical military intelligence to herself. Either path led to potential disaster. Anna sat at her switchboard as the morning progressed, mechanically handling routine calls, her mind barely present as her hands performed the familiar motions of her work. She thought about Colonel Gordov, imagined him returning to his unit with the knowledge that his warning had been acknowledged and dismissed. She thought about the 300,000 men whose fate was already sealed, though most of them did not yet know it. She thought about the Soviet soldiers, who would be tasked with containing a force 3 times larger than they had prepared for, about the pressure this would place on already strained supply lines and combat units. Most of all, she thought about what her responsibility was in this moment. She was a telephone operator, a technical specialist whose job was to facilitate communication, not to analyze strategy or question command decisions. She had no access to the full picture, no understanding of the broader operational considerations that might make the current plan sensible, despite what seemed like a catastrophic intelligence gap. Perhaps there were factors she did not know. Perhaps the senior officer Gordov had spoken to had good reasons for his response. Perhaps reporting this would only reveal her own breach of protocol while contributing nothing of value. But she could not shake the feeling that what she had heard mattered, that somewhere in the chain of command, someone needed to know that a field officer had recognized a critical discrepancy and had been dismissed. The question was whether that someone would listen to a telephone operator who had obtained this information illegally. Anna spent her lunch break walking outside the bunker, pacing through the snow while she wrestled with her decision. The winter sun hung low in the sky, offering light but no warmth, and the distant sound of artillery continued its irregular percussion. She thought about her training, about the oath she had taken when she joined the Communications Corps, about her duty to the military structure that depended on discipline and adherence to protocol. But she also thought about the duty that transcended protocol, the obligation to speak when silence might contribute to catastrophe. In the end, it was the memory of Gordov's voice that decided her. That tone of desperate professionalism, the sound of a man who had done his duty by reporting critical information and had been told it did not matter. Someone needed to hear what he had said, and if she remained silent, she would be participating in the dismissal of his warning. Anna returned to the bunker and requested permission to speak privately with her commanding officer, a signals captain named Volkov, who supervised the communications hub. She had worked under Volkov for 8 months and respected his competence and fairness. When they were alone in the small office adjacent to the switchboard room, she told him what she had done and what she had heard. Volkov listened without interrupting, his expression moving from surprise to concern to something that looked like resignation. When Anna finished, he sat in silence for a long moment, then asked her if she understood the seriousness of what she had done. She confirmed that she did. He asked if she could identify the specific officers involved in the conversation. She provided their designations and the approximate time of the call. He asked why she had chosen to listen rather than disconnect as protocol demanded. She told him the truth, that she had heard something in Gordov's voice that suggested an emergency, and that once she began listening, the content was too important to ignore. Volkov dismissed her back to her post and told her to continue her normal duties. She did not know what he would do with the information, whether he would report her breach of protocol, ignore the entire incident, or forward Gordov's intelligence up the chain of command. She returned to her switchboard and finished her shift, handling calls with the same professional precision as always, though her hands shook slightly whenever she made a connection. 3 days later, on November 26th, Anna was summoned to a meeting with a political officer she had never met before, a major whose presence in their communications hub was unprecedented and ominous. She entered the meeting expecting interrogation, possibly arrest, certainly severe consequences for her violation of protocol. Instead, the major asked her to repeat everything she had told Captain Volkov, taking careful notes as she spoke. He asked detailed questions about the conversation she had intercepted, about the specific numbers Gordov had cited, about the tone and content of the response from strategic headquarters. He did not ask why she had listened. He seemed interested only in what she had heard. At the end of the meeting, the major told her that she had potentially provided valuable intelligence regarding enemy force disposition and that her report had been forwarded to appropriate analytical units. He also told her that her breach of protocol was being noted in her file, but that no formal charges would be brought, given the intelligence value of her report. She was to continue her normal duties and speak of this incident to no one. She was not to attempt to contact Colonel Gordov or confirm any of the information she had reported. She was to return to being exactly what she was supposed to be, an invisible facilitator who connected calls without listening to their content. Anna left the meeting unsure whether she had done something right or wrong, whether her report would make any difference or simply vanish into the vast machinery of military bureaucracy. She returned to her switchboard and continued working, connecting calls, maintaining lines, following protocol with renewed stringency. But she could not stop thinking about those 300,000 men trapped in Stalingrad, about whether anyone was acting on the intelligence discrepancy Gordov had identified, about what was happening in that frozen city as winter deepened and supplies dwindled. Over the following weeks, as December arrived and the siege of Stalingrad continued, Anna began to piece together fragments of the larger story through the calls she connected and the conversations she did not listen to but could not help partially hearing. There was increasing traffic about aerial resupply operations, about transport aircraft and cargo deliveries, about fuel consumption rates and payload capacities. There was traffic about defensive positions around the encirclement, about preventing breakout attempts, about containing an increasingly desperate enemy force. And there was traffic, though less frequent and more guarded, about conditions inside the pocket, about captured soldiers who spoke of hunger and cold, about an army that was beginning to realize the full horror of its situation. The German aerial resupply effort had indeed proven catastrophically insufficient. Intelligence reports that Anna connected but did not officially hear spoke of aircraft struggling to deliver enough supplies to sustain 90,000 men, let alone 300,000. The mathematics that had seemed theoretical when she listened to Gordov's call were now playing out in brutal reality. The trapped soldiers were receiving perhaps 1/3 of the calories they needed, inadequate medical supplies, insufficient ammunition for extended defense. The winter was doing what the surrounding Soviet forces alone might not have accomplished, slowly starving and freezing an entire army. By late December, Calls passing through Anna's switchboard spoke of increasing surrender rates, of enemy soldiers abandoning their positions in search of food, of entire units collapsing not from combat, but from hunger and exposure. The tone of these reports was often one of grim satisfaction, but Anna found herself unable to share that satisfaction. She had heard Gordov's voice, had understood that someone in the field had recognized the scope of what was happening, and had tried to warn higher command. The suffering unfolding in Stalingrad was not just a military victory, but a human catastrophe, one that might have been different if the intelligence discrepancy had been addressed when Gordov first reported it. She never learned what happened to her report. She never discovered whether the information she provided had reached anyone who could act on it, or whether it had been filed away as redundant intelligence that confirmed what was already known. She never found out if Captain Volkov had believed her account was important enough to risk forwarding despite her protocol breach, or if the political officer who interviewed her had genuinely valued her report, or simply documented her violation for potential future use. The military bureaucracy had absorbed her information as it absorbed everything, processing it through channels she could not see, making decisions she would never be privy to, moving forward with plans that exceeded her understanding or authority to question. What Anna did learn, as January 1943 arrived and the siege entered its final phase, was that Colonel Dmitry Pavlovich Gordov had been correct in every particular. The trapped force numbered approximately 290,000 men, almost exactly the figure he had reported in late November. The aerial resupply effort had failed to deliver adequate supplies, averaging less than 100 tons per day when 300 tons were the minimum required. The winter had been exceptionally harsh, with temperatures dropping below -30 degrees, and the human cost had been exactly what Gordov had feared, a slow catastrophe of starvation and freezing that reduced a powerful military force to a desperate collection of starving men. In early February 1943, the remaining forces in Stalingrad surrendered. Of the approximately 290,000 men who had been encircled in late November, only 91,000 survived to become prisoners. The rest had perished from combat, starvation, exposure, and disease. It was one of the most decisive engagements of the entire conflict, a turning point that shifted the momentum on the Eastern Front, but the victory had come with a human cost that Anna found difficult to process. Those were not abstract numbers. They were human beings, each with a name, a history, people who waited for them, dreams they would never realize. Anna continued working at her switchboard through the winter and spring of 1943. She connected calls, maintained lines, followed protocol with rigorous precision. She never again deliberately listened to a conversation after making a connection. She never spoke about what she had heard on November 23rd, not even to Captain Volkov, who transferred to another unit in March, and never referenced their conversation from November. She became exactly what the military communication system required her to be, an invisible facilitator, a ghost in the machine. But she never forgot the sound of Gordov's voice, that mixture of professional duty and barely contained horror as he reported what he had discovered. She never forgot the dismissive response from strategic headquarters, the suggestion that his numbers had been noted but would not change the plan. And she never stopped wondering whether her decision to listen and report had mattered at all, whether somewhere in the vast machinery of military command someone had acted on the intelligence she provided, or whether it had simply confirmed what was already known but could not be changed. Years after the conflict ended, Anna learned what had happened to Colonel Dmitry Pavlovich Gordov. He had survived the engagement and continued serving with distinction through 1945, eventually being decorated for his leadership during several critical operations. She never contacted him, never told him that she had heard his call, never revealed that his warning had been forwarded through channels he never knew existed. There seemed to be no purpose in such a revelation. What mattered had been his willingness to speak when he recognized something critical, her decision to listen when protocol demanded she disconnect, and the knowledge that sometimes duty required making choices that transcended regulation and protocol. The communications hub where Anna worked was dismantled in late 1945 as military units demobilized and returned to peacetime operations. She returned to Leningrad, or what remained of it after the terrible siege that city had endured, and eventually resumed civilian telecommunications work. She married a returning soldier in 1947, had 2 children, and lived a quiet life that bore no obvious traces of her wartime service. But she kept her headset from the military switchboard, a battered piece of equipment that sat in a drawer of her desk for the rest of her life, a reminder of the morning she had chosen to listen rather than disconnect. In 1973, 30 years after the events at Stalingrad, Anna was interviewed as part of an oral history project documenting the experiences of women who had served in military communications during the conflict. She told the interviewer about her work connecting calls, about the technical challenges of maintaining communications across vast distances, about the camaraderie among the operators who shared the unique pressure of their responsibilities. She did not mention the call she had intercepted on November 23, 1942. The interviewer never asked about protocol breaches or unauthorized listening, and Anna saw no reason to confess to a violation that had occurred 3 decades earlier. But at the end of the interview, when asked if there were any aspects of her service that stood out as particularly memorable, Anna paused for a long moment before responding. She said that the hardest part of being a telephone operator had been the helplessness of knowing things without being able to act on them, of connecting voices that spoke of desperate situations while remaining voiceless herself. She said that the military communications system depended on operators being invisible and silent, but that sometimes the weight of what they heard exceeded the capacity for silence. She did not elaborate, and the interviewer moved on to other questions, but in that moment, Anna came as close as she ever would to publicly acknowledging what she had done and what she had heard. The question of whether Anna's report made any difference to the conduct of the siege remains unanswerable. There is no documentary evidence that her interception of Gordov's call influenced strategic decisions or changed the allocation of resources around Stalingrad. The intelligence discrepancy Gordov identified was almost certainly known to Soviet command through multiple sources, and the decision to maintain the existing containment plan, despite the higher-than-expected enemy numbers, was likely made for complex strategic reasons that transcended any single intelligence report. The outcome at Stalingrad was determined by logistics, weather, military capability and decisions made at the highest levels of command, not by the unauthorized listening of a single telephone operator. But what matters in the end is not whether Anna's choice had measurable strategic impact. What matters is that when faced with a conflict between protocol and conscience, between the rules that governed her duties and the sense that what she was hearing needed to be heard by others, she made a choice. She listened when she was supposed to disconnect. She spoke when she was supposed to remain silent. She risked consequences because the alternative, doing nothing, felt impossible given what she had heard. Her breach of protocol was small in the vast scope of the conflict, her report probably redundant given the information available to strategic planners, her impact on events likely negligible. But she acted according to what she believed was right. And in a military system that demanded obedience and invisibility, that act of individual moral courage was itself significant, regardless of its practical consequences. The 300,000 men trapped in Stalingrad faced their fate because of strategic decisions made at the highest levels of command, because of logistical failures, because of weather and geography, and the accumulated weight of choices made long before the encirclement closed. Anna Mikhailovna Volkova did not cause their suffering and could not prevent it. But on the morning of November 23, 1942, she heard someone trying to warn of the scope of what was unfolding, and she chose to amplify that warning rather than let it disappear into bureaucratic dismissal. Whether anyone listened, whether anything changed, whether her choice mattered in any concrete way, she never knew. But she made the choice anyway, and she lived with it for the rest of her life, carrying the knowledge that sometimes duty means listening when you are supposed to be deaf, speaking when you are supposed to be silent, and accepting that you may never know whether your choice made any difference at all. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.